So I'm excited to be here today, and I'm excited to share a story with you. And this story, it's inspired by my two children, my two boys. Especially every night I read with them, went right before bed. And the one night I was reading a story to my one son, this is how the story came involved. 3. 3 is such an important number, and it's such a simple number at that, too. It's one with profound depth, and it's also a symbolic component to analytics everywhere. This simple number is embedded in our DNA, whether you subconsciously see it or not. And it's also a large driver into how we understand things, between physics, between how we communicate as human beings. In analytics, 3 is the smallest number to form a pattern. In physics, 3, we have the 3 classical states of matter: solid, liquid, gas. We also have Newton's 3 laws of motion. And the third law is actually my personal favorite. And that law is, for every action, you have an equal and opposite reaction. I apply that law constantly to both my personal life as well as my professional life. In communication, we have things like ABC, little pigs, 3 little pigs, snap, crackle, pop. And in the spirit of storytelling, we also have the beginning, middle, and end. So today, you're going to see many examples of how I leverage this magical number in things such as my visualizations, the solutions that we develop, as well as the execution. I'm currently the Director of Supply Chain Analytics over at Sig Vendor Jewelers. We're headquartered out in Fairlawn, Ohio, so just a short hop down the road. And as mentioned previously, we are the largest retailer of diamond jewelry. So you might ask yourself, who is Signet anyways? Well, I am confident that there's a high probability of that at least 90% of all the folks in this room has actually bought something, either directly or indirectly, through one of our iconic banners. With 11 iconic banners ranging from Jared, Kay, Zales, we have Banter, we just purchased Roxbox and Diamonds Direct. We service a lot of customers. And we operate in approximately 2,800 stores globally, between the US, Canada, and UK. Now, from a supply chain perspective, we work with so many different suppliers, and they help us in doing what we do best, and that's celebrating and creating memories through jewelry. Now, I've been with Signet for a little over 3.5 years, but recently I moved over in the supply chain about 6 months ago. And with all the economic turmoil, the geopolitical turmoil, this is what I feel to be a phenomenal time to be supply chain side and supply chain analytics, because it allows me to essentially help Signet overcome a lot of challenges that every company is currently facing today. Imagination. I absolutely love this quote by Albert Einstein, as it is so pure. Logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will take you everywhere. Imagination is an attribute that I also apply every day to my career as well as my personal life. Earlier in the year, when I transferred into the supply chain group, I wanted to create what I imagined to be a supply chain analytics flywheel. And I wanted to do this using a first principles approach to everything. Now, to understand our approach and how we drove analytics, let's first understand the mindset. The analytic flywheel. Now, we're going to discuss the analytic flywheel a little bit more in detail here shortly. But in simplistic terms and in mechanical engineering terms, think of it as really just a gigantic disk that continues to spin. And as that spin continues, it's building up kinetic energy and building up that momentum as it spins. And that flywheel is driven off by just a small little motor. First principles approach. So first principles, if you've never heard of the term before, it's really defined as the fundamental proposition or assumption that ultimately stands on its own and cannot be further deduced, or also known as finding the fundamental truths. So for an example, let's take the large 4-quadrant box that we see on the screen. If we take that and we would deduce it, we can infer that that large 4-quadrant box is made up of 4 equally sized squares. Deducing that even further, we can infer that those squares are made up of lines. That line represents the first principle. I also call it, in just common speak, finding the lowest common denominator. Supply chain. As defined by Webster, really, a supply chain is nothing more than just a network of individuals and companies that are involved in basically producing a product and delivering it to its customers. So let's combine all these three together. And for Signet, we largely operate on a finished goods basis, meaning that we purchase finished product from our vendors, and then we therefore sell that finished product at our locations. So therefore, the first principle is that we sell merchandise, individual merchandise or SKUs, in our brick and mortar as well as our e-commerce locations. Now, we also have a second first principle. And that second first principle is we buy individual SKUs from vendors. So these two first principles became really the foundation for what we created in terms of a dual analytic flywheel. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper in that flywheel. As I mentioned just previously a few minutes ago, the flywheel is just a gigantic wheel that just continuously spins and builds and creates kinetic momentum energy. That spin is initially driven by just a small little motor. Now, as that momentum builds and continues to generate, it's going to continue to generate and feed more and more energy into essentially the flywheel itself. And that energy could be reinvested back into the flywheel or back into the motor to really drive out even further throughput and production. It gets to a point where so much momentum is created that you could toggle down that motor without compromising the execution of that flywheel. Now, in terms of analytics, data and information is everywhere. And it can be consumed and interrogated and compounded in ways that generate more and more momentum, just like this flywheel. So what we do is we use the analytic flywheel to really create those information points, many information points, and many different types of insight. And each of those insight components stand on its own. However, if you reinvest in those insights and reinvest in those data points into the flywheel, you could create a whole array of insight that is ultimately compounded. So, as I mentioned, so far, while I've been within the supply chain side, we've created 2 flywheels. The first flywheel is what we branded internally as Sig Inventory. This flywheel is focusing on the first principle of we sell merchandise to our customers through our e-commerce sites and brick and mortar sites. This flywheel and all components in that flywheel is really addressing that customer or the Signet to customer aspect of our supply chain. So for an example, if we have the Sig Inventory Optimization Accelerator, we take that and we also brought in the Purchase Price Parity Index. And we fed those two individual components into our control tower. That control tower leverages all that information on all those different data points that we've created from those two separately independent components or analytic components. And we were able to identify ways to optimize our inventory from a ship from store or an e-commerce perspective. Now, each component, the Sig Inventory Optimization Accelerator, as well as the Purchase Price Parity Index, those serve on its own. Those stand alone, and they serve different insight needs and data points that we could extrapolate. But as I mentioned, if you compound those insights and you combine them, you could create a whole new component and functionality that is available to be reinvested into other parts of your supply chain or other parts of your business. Sig Vendor 360 focuses on the second first principle, and that's where we buy goods from our vendors. And this is where we identify opportunities to really optimize our end-to-end kind of perspective from the supply chain, really addressing and focusing on the vendor to Signet side of the business. Now, for the remainder of our journey today and the remainder of our story, we're going to dive deeper into Sig Vendor 360 and explain how we created this and how we use it to drive analytics everywhere. So now that we understand the flywheel approach and a little bit about first principles, let's begin the main story or the main journey. And let's first start with what it was like before. We have many different teams, just like any other organization within Signet, that touch vendor management. Those include our merchandise teams, our sourcing teams, legal and compliance, supply chain. Before Sig Vendor 360, each team essentially did their own type of work. They were independent, they were siloed, and they were creating insight based on their own personal needs to drive out business for their department. Now, because of this was done in silos, there was a lot of duplicative work. And a lot of that work also overlapped. And it created what I call essentially data and process proliferation. Now, in addition, through the many acquisitions that we've made over the years, we've also added a ton of different disparate systems to our technology stack. So for most of the teams, this data was difficult to acquire. Now, we do have an enterprise data warehouse, but that doesn't contain every single component of our data points. And because this data was difficult to acquire by the teams, it did create a lot of manual processes, and those manual processes took a lot of time and effort to execute. Now, these manual processes were generally accompanied by Excel spreadsheets, and I could guarantee pretty much 100% with absolute certainty, everyone in this room touches Excel spreadsheets one way or another. Now, those Excel spreadsheets were located everywhere across our network drives. Now, let's talk about Excel just for a quick second. As I mentioned, 100% with complete certainty that everyone's touching Excel spreadsheets on a day-to-day basis. That means every organization's using it, and they're using it profoundly. However, Excel really has not evolved over the last 35 years since it's been in its existence. 1985 is when Excel was first created. Simply put, right now, because of that lack of evolution in Excel, it's just making it very difficult for teams to really do and capitalize on analytics everywhere. Case in point, try loading and doing anything with a simple data set of 1.1 million records. Throw that in Excel and tell me how you could execute that effectively. Between the manual processes, the many disparate teams kind of operating on their own, this meant that our vendor management was difficult to scale. So now let's talk about what it's like with Sig Vendor 360. Well, we have connected teams. Everyone's now operating as a team. We're now connected all those teams through a centralized kind of hub, if you will, or portal, using SharePoint. And in that portal, we are sharing various information. Now, we still have disparate systems where we are in the process of harmonizing all our disparate systems, but that's taken a lot of work, and it will take a lot of time to harmonize. So what we've been doing is leveraging two tools that we already have in existence at Signet, a combination of Altrix and Tableau to really integrate and bring in all that data from all those different disparate systems. Now with Sig Vendor 360, we're able to make more robust decisions. And some of those robust decisions that we're able to drive is through quarterly vendor reviews and corrective actions. We're able to take now facts from all those different teams. We're able to take facts and really make a good story with the vendor to kind of help them out. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper in how we executed. We have 4 indices. Those 4 indices within Sig Vendor 360 really cover, if you will, a end-to-end kind of view and perspective. So we are looking at how to narrate that vendor story through sustainability and compliance index, through pre-consumer index. Both of those are kind of like the pre-consumer side of the house. We also have our consumer at market perspective and our post-consumer index. All of these 4 indices are measuring various components from a supply chain end-to-end perspective. That's done through an evaluation array. We're creating a massive array of different data points, different kind of evaluations, different metrics. Now, each of those metrics stand on its own. However, we're bringing all that into a gigantic array so that we could capitalize and compound on that information. To do that, we're also using standard deviation and clustering to drive out a lot of those scoring efforts. Now, our business is cyclical in nature. We have a high degree of sales volume inherently during the holiday season as well as wedding season. So we needed to approach our scoring and our metrics in a way that would not compromise that cyclical nature. So we're doing it through standard deviation and clustering. Now, tool sets. In analytics, I fundamentally believe that the best solution is really one that leverages a multi-array of tools. So for Sig Vendor 360, we're leveraging a trifecta of Altrix, Tableau, and SharePoint. Now let's dive just a little bit deeper into those components. What is Altrix? Well, Altrix, with many companies, we have many different disparate systems, and those disparate systems drive both financial reporting and data needs, as well as just business functions. As a result of that, everything is disparate in terms of we need to access information from X, Y, and Z data points. So to make things a little bit more easier, we could essentially use Altrix in a way to connect to the various different data systems. We don't need a gigantic cloud-based solution just to enable analytics. We could leverage Altrix to connect to different data points. I don't need to have a giant cloud to connect to. I could connect to every single data point. It doesn't matter where that data sits. So with this, every company from the companies that I've worked with, what we're using Altrix for right now is really a compounded kind of tool set. So we're using it as a ETL tool. We're using it as a robotic process automation tool. And we're also using it to drive advanced analytics. Now, Altrix has enabled me and our teams to really spawn some of the craziest and wildest things from an idea perspective in terms of data and analytics. As I mentioned with Altrix, I don't care where data sits. I could connect to any number of disparate systems. It also doesn't matter how much data I need to consume. I could easily consume it. best of all, Altrix it allows us to really accommodate a whole array of different types of users. You have the application itself accommodates things like the passenger who want a no-code kind of environment. It also accommodates the pilot who wants a low-code environment. And then it also accommodates the astronaut or the data scientists, which love coding and they want to do a whole array and in-depth information and kind of data set from that perspective. So let's see how we used Altrix for our vendor analysis. This workflow that I have on the screen, you can see we have 6 different red boxes. Those 6 different red boxes indicate 6 different database tables that we're connected to across many disparate systems. The gray box in the middle is just a simple set of instructions that basically tell the workflow, this is what I want to do, and this is how I want to curate my data. The green boxes are essentially the outputs. So one of the outputs is going out to a Tableau hyperfile so that we could do visualizations. Another output is going out to a Excel file. And we also have another output that emails all of our end users that Excel file and it picks it up. Now, this is just one of many workflows that we have at Signet and how we're leveraging Altrix to drive out our analytics everywhere perspective. It's so simple for us to really create an analytic masterpiece. One of our biggest analytic masterpieces is Sig Inventory. Sig Inventory is essentially, think of it as one gigantic thing, one gigantic workflow of this. But that workflow connects to well over 100 different database tables across 8+ different disparate systems. And it basically creates a unique analytic masterpiece. So let's continue along our journey. Tableau, we as humans are visual in nature. For us and for our vendor story, what we want to do is create discoverable and static insight. So we wanted to create that kind of storytelling process. Now, the vast majority of our analytic workflows from an Altrix perspective feed into essentially that visualized insight into Tableau. It's also designed to scale. So from our Tableau perspective, as we scale, as we build and continue along the array of various workflows and various tests, we don't have to do anything. Those tests are automatically and systematically integrated directly into our Tableau dashboards. So it's just seamless for us. It was also important for us to offer, through our Tableau solution, many different perspectives. So what we've built, and what we'll go over just a few examples, is an executive view, an in-depth view, as well as a vendor-facing view. So what I have on the screen here is a executive view, and all too often have I seen dashboards, whether it's Tableau, Power BI, ClickView, you name it. All too many times I see executive views just littered with clutter. So here, in the spirit of the rule of 3, we're using essentially 3 kind of segments or segmentations of our visualizations. So on the left side of the dashboard, you just have a high-level kind of view of, hey, this is our total count, and this is kind of where we stand along the spectrum for our vendor scoring. And on the 2 right sections, those give us insight into who our top vendors are within each of the 4 indices, as well as who are the vendors that we need to work with a little bit deeper on within that indice perspective. This executive view could also be used just as a lift and shift kind of perspective. So you could copy it, snag it, put it into a PowerPoint deck, or you could also PDF it. We also wanted to create an in-depth view. So each test that we create drives out a lot of different components. And those components, we wanted to make sure that we provide even deeper insight into those components and those tests for our end users. So each test has a drill downable kind of view similar to this, where it's essentially segmented and you could drill and discover insight. So you could really define and identify any kind of trends from a specific vendor perspective or from a holistic perspective as well. This particular one is for our quality control. So think of it as this is the type of stuff that we do kind of pre-check. Once we receive vendor merchandise into our DC, we pre-check it before we ship it out to our various locations. The other component is our SharePoint lists. Here we've integrated SharePoint. We're using SharePoint lists to help drive out and kind of mitigate the need for Excel. We do understand that, folks, and there is still a need for some Excel kind of analysis and information. So we're using SharePoint lists instead to really drive out those. And through our SharePoint, we're also using and leveraging process automation. So as somebody inputs information into a SharePoint list, that kicks off process flows for approvals, notifications, emails, and such. And then it's also scalable. So with Altrix, with Tableau, we're able to bring everything really into kind of SharePoint and really create a hub. And that hub is pretty much like this. Here, this is where our end users will go to. They could do a number of different things with this. They could input information into a SharePoint list to drive out specific vendor components. They could hit the two 360 icons, and that gets you directly into our Tableau dashboards. And then we are also building and developing other things like a generate VBA. We're using Altrix, and that link right there is allowing an end user to go into a Altrix gallery, and once they go into that, they will essentially click a button. That button will drive out kind of a little user interface. They'll select a vendor, and then that button and that workflow in Altrix drives out and generates a legal document for our vendor buying agreements. This here is just an example of our SharePoint list that we're using. We've created a custom form so that users go in. It's very direct and defined from a data perspective, so we have integrity. We're maintaining data integrity. Now, I want to get back to that rule of three a little bit here. It's been great sharing this story, and this is just a short time for the story, and the story could continue, but unfortunately we can't. We can't continue the story. So what I wanted to do is just leave you with three key points and three keepsakes to take with you as you embark and continue with your analytic journey and really embarking on analytics everywhere. First, we talked about the mindset that was used and how we are using an analytic flywheel coupled up with applying first principles approach to really enabling and driving analytics everywhere. We're also using tool sets. We talked about a number of tool sets and how a plethora of tool sets is the right solution. For Signet, we're using 3 tool sets. For your organization, you might be using different tool sets, and that's okay. But don't limit yourself into just one tool set. See what and capitalize on a plethora of tool sets. And most importantly, I want to talk a little bit about, I want to leave with you the component of imagination and how every person in this room can overcome those limitations of data and analytics, and instead let our imagination and creativity really take you to new insight. And all it takes is just a little bit of imagination that you could bring to your organization, and that will create a delta. It will create change for your organization, and it will ultimately unlock analytics everywhere. And through that imagination, I'm very confident that you could be that delta. You could drive out that change for that organization, just like we're driving out that change for Signet in terms of our improving our bottom line, improving our relationship with not only our vendors, but also, and more importantly, with our customers. And we also want to drive out and change how we improve our employees. and how we empower them through analytics. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to the moderators for any questions. There's that one.
Thank you. Hello? Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to go ahead with one question first of all. So one of the things that you mentioned was that you're using Excel, in a lot of data silos and everything. A lot of times Excel has a lot of business rules embedded in spreadsheets, and it's often you don't even know what the business rules are that are being implemented through various different formulas and everything that are there. And then that leads to potentially conflicting business rules. So I'm wondering how do you figure out where you have conflicting business rules, and how does the combination of Altrix and Tableau help you to eliminate those conflicts so that you actually are not working against yourself in various different parts of your business?
Yeah, I love that question. So, and it's kind of been the common theme through the two prior speakers, and really kind of empowering and working with your partners. So as we've been interrogating and looking at the data, inevitably we're dealing with spreadsheets. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of business rules to those spreadsheets. So we're working with our partners and working with those individuals to really understand what are those business rules? What are they doing with those spreadsheets? Because with Altrix and Tableau, we are then taking those rules, and essentially automating it. So somebody might be doing a bunch of VLOOKUPs or using pivot tables and that kind of stuff, or bringing in and blending data from many disparate systems. We're understanding what they're doing and then taking that rule set and really just building it into Altrix and building it into an Altrix workflow. And then as such, now we've created an automated process so that they're not having to spend a lot of time to build those kind of rule sets, and we could still use that and really do it in a way where we're maintaining data integrity.
Thank you. Do we have any audience questions right now? Okay, I think Susan. Thank you. Yes, there are two microphones down here. We didn't realize it. Okay, Susan, do you have a question?
I do. So I know that you guys are a pretty big omni-channel retailer, and I'm curious to know how you're able to take the data that you're collecting and the insights about vendors, and how does that translate to the customer experience?
So in the spirit of analytics everywhere, we have many different types of systems and many different kind of data points. So we have repair systems, which basically give us insight into when customers bring in repairs, what are those repairs? We have our point of sale system. So we're bringing in all that information into who's buying and also who's returning. But then we have our e-commerce site. And through that e-commerce site, we have what we call voice of the customer, meaning that you could, as a customer, provide reviews and insight into what was wrong with that particular merchandise. Did you like it? Did you not like it? Did you return it? And if you return it, we could extrapolate all that information. So think of it as we're bringing in a ton of different data sets from various components and bringing it all into one, similar to our QC side. So when we bring it into our DC, we're pre-checking things. So we could kind of see where things are flowing, what are we seeing before it gets to our customers. And then from there, we're able to take all that information and work with our vendors to say, hey, this is what we're seeing. From a repair side, we're seeing that this particular SKU or this particular merchandise is breaking. It might be a broken shank, it might be loose diamonds. So now what we're doing is we're working with the vendors to kind of help figure out what can they do on their side to remedy that situation. But then at the same time, we're taking things and that information on our side, and we're boosting up our quality control process as well. Because ultimately, if the customer is not happy, then that basically falls upstream to us as Signet, but then ultimately falls upstream to our vendors. So if our customers are not happy on that merchandise, ultimately our vendors have a huge stake in it because it would just be something that we would not buy again because customers just don't like it.
Okay, thank you. I think we have one question in the audience. This is going to have to be our last question.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. My one question, though, is are you guys currently using any predictive analytics in terms of forecasting for either supply chain, both, upstream and downstream?
Yep, so great question. We are exploring a couple different things, and I know earlier there was a mention of a digital twin. We are exploring and starting to kind of tap into a digital twin perspective as well. So taking things right now from a digital twin and really kind of focusing on that first component of the first principle of kind of optimizing our inventory at our stores. But as we continue to build out that digital twin, we're going to start bringing into components of building a digital twin within our supply chain from a vendor perspective as well. So it's definitely in the works. We've been kind of working on that over the past number of months, and really excited to see the outcome of those digital twin components here in the next year or so.
Thank you very much, Sean. I want to just say that if Sean has the secret of how we can stamp out Excel, then I think we should all be beating a pathway right to his doorstep. So thank you very much, Sean, and we really appreciate it. Very interesting presentation.